Why Sherpa Palchen Tamang had to leave. On May 21st, 2025, Subrata Ghosh, a 45-year-old schoolteacher from West Bengal, stood on the roof of the world. After years of training and sacrifice, he had reached the summit of Mount Everest at 2 p.m. For him, it was not only the culmination of personal ambition, but also a proud moment for his family, friends, and students back home in India. But the dream unraveled almost immediately. The descent, always more dangerous than the climb, became a nightmare. Subrata grew weak, his steps faltering. Altitude sickness clouded his mind, exhaustion consumed his body, and before long he could no longer walk. By his side was Sherpa Palchen Tamang, a man trained to guide climbers through the mountain's cruelest conditions. Palchen urged, pleaded, and tried to pull Subrata down the ridge. But as hours passed, both men slipped deeper into the death zone where oxygen is thin, and survival is measured in minutes. And then came the decision that would haunt Palchen forever. He left. He descended alone, frostbitten and hallucinating, unable to carry his client any further. Subrata remained behind, still alive, but doomed. This is the story of why Sherpa Palchen Tamang left Subrata Ghosh on Everest in 2025, an act born not of indifference, but of the brutal limits of human survival. But who was Subrata Ghosh? Before his name was added to the long, tragic list of Everest casualties, Subrata Ghosh was known simply as Sir to his students in Ranaghat, West Bengal. By profession, he was a schoolteacher, but in spirit, he was an adventurer, someone who believed that the lessons of life weren't confined to books or classrooms, but written on the slopes of mountains. At 45, Subrata had already achieved what many considered extraordinary. He wasn't a thrill-seeker chasing fame. Instead, he was a dedicated climber who had methodically built his experience over years. Reports noted that he had summited more than a dozen peaks across India and beyond. Friends and fellow climbers described him as disciplined, patient, and deeply respectful of the mountains. Everest, however, was his ultimate dream. For climbers across India, standing atop the world's highest mountain is a badge of honor, proof that determination can overcome geography, age, and circumstance. Subrata wanted to show that someone from his small town, a teacher by trade, could join the ranks of those who conquered Everest. In May 2025, he finally did. At 2 p.m., he reached the summit with Sherpa Palchen Tamang by his side. Photographs and radio calls confirmed his success. But in mountaineering, the summit is only half the journey. The descent is where Everest reveals its cruelty. And for Subrata, that cruelty came swiftly. His dream would last only a few hours longer before it dissolved into exhaustion, confusion, and tragedy. The spring of 2025 began with cautious optimism on Everest, after the deadly seasons of 2023 and 2024, where overcrowding and unpredictable weather had caused dozens of fatalities. Many feared that 2025 would become even worse. Hundreds of climbing permits were issued, base camps swelled with tents and flags, and the atmosphere was tense. Everyone was waiting for the fabled weather window when the jet stream would ease and climbers could make their final push. When the window finally opened in mid-May, teams surged toward the upper camps. Sherpas worked tirelessly fixing ropes, hauling oxygen bottles, and preparing the way. For most climbers, this was the culmination of years of preparation and tens of thousands of dollars spent. Every step upward carried the weight of ambition. But Everest doesn't care about ambition. At 8,848 meters, the air is so thin that the human body begins to die the moment it enters the death zone. Climbers must fight not only the mountain, but their own failing physiology. In 2025, two names would be etched into the season's history. Philip Santiago, a climber who collapsed at Camp Roman 4, and Subrata Ghosh, who perished during his descent from the summit. What made Subrata's death particularly haunting was not only the fact that he had reached the summit, but that his Sherpa guide, Palchen Tamang, had to make the devastating choice to leave him alive on the mountain. Palchen himself barely survived. He staggered back to Camp Roman 4 frostbitten, oxygen deprived, and hallucinating. His confession afterward, "I was too tired to help him," sparked outrage, sympathy, and a painful reminder of what the death zone does to human beings. The 2025 season was not the bloodbath many had predicted, but it still carried tragedy. And Subrata's story, more than any other, revealed the thin line between triumph and death on Everest. For Subrata Ghosh, May 21st, 2025, was the culmination of a dream. Just after 2 p.m., he stepped onto the summit of Mount Everest. At 45 years old, the schoolteacher from West Bengal had finally conquered the highest point on Earth. The moment was emotional. He raised the Indian flag, radioed a message of triumph, and took photographs against the endless sky. After years of sacrifice and months of grueling training, Subrata had achieved what so many only imagined. But on Everest, the summit is never the end, it is the halfway mark, and descending after 2 p.m. is dangerous. Experienced guides warn climbers that the mountain turns deadly late in the day. When oxygen runs low, temperatures plummet, and exhaustion takes over. Subrata was already fatigued, but determined to descend with his Sherpa, Palchen Tamang. Within hours, however, his strength collapsed. He began moving slower, taking breaks every few steps. Signs of altitude sickness set in: disorientation, confusion, and slurred speech. Palchen encouraged him, tugged at his harness, and urged him to keep going. But the higher they were, the thinner the air, and every step down felt like lifting a mountain. By the time they reached the Hillary step on the way down, Subrata's condition had worsened dramatically. He stumbled, collapsed into the snow, and refused to rise. Palchen tried again and again, pleading with him to move. "We must go," he begged, but Subrata no longer responded. The descent, always more dangerous than the climb, had claimed him. Now, the Sherpa faced an impossible situation: stay with Subrata in the death zone, risking his own life, or descend alone and hope for survival. It was here, beneath the Hillary step, that the tragedy of 2025 reached its breaking point: the death zone decision. By the time night fell over Everest, Sherpa Palchen was trapped in one of the cruelest dilemmas imaginable. Subrata Ghosh lay motionless in the snow, alive but refusing or unable to move. The storm of exhaustion and altitude sickness had consumed him. Palchen had already spent hours trying to coax him down, shouting, shaking, even pulling on his harness. But the death zone is merciless. At nearly 8,800 meters, every breath feels like drowning. Muscles fail. The brain starves for oxygen. Even the strongest Sherpa is just as vulnerable as the clients they guide. Palchen himself was collapsing. His oxygen supply was nearly gone, his fingers numb with frostbite, his vision clouded by hallucinations. He knew what every second meant. The longer he stayed, the more likely it was that both he and Subrata would die. And so, in the cold darkness of the death zone, he made the choice no guide ever wants to make. He unclipped from Subrata, whispered a final plea for him to rise, and began the descent alone. Later, when Palchen staggered back into Camp Roman 4, his body ravaged by frostbite and exhaustion, he could only tell rescuers the truth: "I was too tired to help him." Subrata remained on the mountain, still breathing when Palchen left, but abandoned to a fate no one could reverse. And why he was left? Why was Subrata Ghosh left on Everest while still alive? To answer that, we need to understand the brutal arithmetic of the death zone. At altitudes above 8,000 meters, the human body is shutting down. Muscles waste away, organs starve, and the brain struggles to process reality. Even the strongest climbers are operating at a fraction of their normal strength. For Sherpa Palchen, who had already spent hours in the death zone guiding Subrata to the summit and back down, his reserves were gone. He was hallucinating, frostbitten, and barely standing. Carrying a climber in that environment is nearly impossible. A single step downhill requires enormous effort. Dragging or lifting another person would take several rescuers working in perfect coordination. But Palchen was alone. The terrain itself made rescue unthinkable. Just below the Hillary step, the descent is steep, narrow, and exposed. To attempt to move an incapacitated climber there would have been suicidal. And then there was time. Subrata had collapsed late in the day. Darkness was falling. Oxygen was nearly depleted. To stay longer meant certain death for both men. So Palchen faced the unthinkable: save himself or die with his client. In the death zone, there are no good choices, only survival or sacrifice. That is why Subrata was left on the mountain, not because his Sherpa abandoned him casually, but because Everest itself made rescue impossible. When news broke of Subrata Ghosh's death, the reactions were immediate and divided. Some saw his Sherpa, Palchen as a man who abandoned his duty. Others saw him as a survivor who faced an impossible choice. The debate was not new. Everest history is filled with moments where climbers were left alive but unattended, judged too weak to save. Critics ask, isn't the very purpose of hiring a Sherpa guide to ensure that clients return safely? Doesn't that responsibility continue even in the death zone? But Sherpas are not superhuman. They are subject to the same thin air, the same exhaustion, the same risks. Palchen had spent hours at high altitude, guiding, pulling, and urging Subrata down. His body was shutting down, his mind slipping into hallucinations. If he had stayed, it's almost certain both men would have perished. This raises one of the central ethical dilemmas of mountaineering: where does responsibility end? At sea level, abandoning someone still alive is unthinkable. On Everest, it happens again and again. Climbers rationalize it as survival. You save who you can, many guides say, but sometimes the mountain decides. The commercialization of Everest also deepens the debate. Subrata was a paying client and experienced climber, yes, but still dependent on the Sherpa system. Did the business of Everest push him beyond his limits? Was the summit pursued too late in the day, when conditions were already against him? Could stricter decision-making have prevented the tragedy altogether? In India, his death struck a chord. To his students and community, he was not just another Everest statistic. He was a teacher, a mentor, and a man who dared to dream. The fact that he died still alive, within reach of the world below, made the loss even harder to bear. And so, the debate rages on. Was Palchen's decision abandonment or inevitability? Was Subrata's death a failure of guidance or the price Everest demands? There are no simple answers. Only the haunting truth that on Everest, survival often means choosing who cannot be saved. Subrata Ghosh achieved what so many only dream of. He stood on the highest point on earth, carrying the hopes of his family, his students, and his country. But the mountain reminded him and all of us that the summit is only half the journey. His tragic death on the descent is not just another entry in Everest's long record of casualties. It is a story of ambition, exhaustion, and the cruel mathematics of the death zone. It is also the story of the Sherpa forced into an impossible choice, Palchen, who stayed as long as he could, and then left to save his own life. Was he wrong? Was he right? These are questions that echo across every Everest tragedy. In an environment where survival is measured breath by breath, morality bends under the crushing weight of reality. What remains is the legacy of Subrata Ghosh, a teacher who dared to chase the sky, and whose final lesson is carved into the slopes of Everest itself. The lesson that triumph and tragedy on this mountain are separated by the thinnest of lines. On Everest, dreams soar higher than anywhere else. But so, too, does the cost.